a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be, if we met at midnight, in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I'm looking into all things coffee as I bake my way through 2025. I found a recipe for coffee cookies and coffee cheesecake. Do you really bake cheesecake? I have tried a few and they were surprisingly good, while others made me realize just because you have the recipe, it doesn't mean it's going to work out for you. If I could, I would make coffee enchiladas and coffee tacos. The coffee tends to run out one end. I do have coffee air fresheners. I need some coffee aftershave. Once I perfect my cookie and coffee recipes, I'm going to give them to Julio and see if he can maybe put them out to the world. Well, at least the world around the shop, and partake of yummy snacks to go along with their yummy drinks. They also have a baker at the coffee shop now. I did make a coffee cake with coffee in it one time. It was a bit heavy. It was very heavy, in fact. I also tried bacon flavored coffee one time, but, well, it was an adventure all by itself. It didn't taste like coffee, it tasted like bacon that you drank. I had mixed feelings about that. If you'd like to partake of the best coffee in the universe, head on over to 4501 McPherson, the Organic Man Coffee Trike, and drink only the best. If it's too far to drive, go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop and have it delivered to your front door. David Subith asked me about Paul McCartney. The story of his death from 1966, which was and still is a legend worth looking into. He also asked me about Elvis's tombstone, how they misspelled his name. I went after the story of death and replacement like I do any show, with lots of confusion and too many pages of information. I did find out some things I never knew about the Beatles, and I thought you might like to know this as well. Like why their name is misspelled. Beetle is Beetle, but they spell it Beatle. Well, that name actually comes from being the beat, like music, not the bugs, even though the name did come from the crickets. More on this later. I'm going to talk about a lot of other things besides McCartney possibly being dead, simply because I find it part of the story and highly fascinating, and hopefully you will too. In the mid 1950s, folks were somewhat limited in the music they could listen to on the radio, especially in Britain. The folks running the country just knew they were duty bound to protect each and every one of us from the things that we wanted. Radio stations were shut down because they played the wrong kinds of music. Rock and roll was here to stay, but those people wanted to do away with it and control our lives. People heard rhythm and blues being played, and they wanted to get in on this new music. Suddenly, kids and a few adults began picking up guitars and banging on drums in an attempt to make new sounds. Some kids were surprised to discover playing music can be hard. Playing new music could be really hard. Playing music that folks wanted to listen to could be downright impossible. A lot of bands were formed, learned to play other people's music, and disbanded. Names were chosen trying to be unusual or associated with something, like the M&B 5 wanting to be associated with the M&B Brewery in London. The Quarrymen wanted to be associated with the Quarry Bank High School in Liverpool. When choosing a name, you need a lot of research combined with a lot more luck. What will stick in people's minds and keep you there? In November 1956, 16-year-old John Lennon formed a group with several friends from the Quarry Bank High School. Their music was actually folk music combined with rhythm and blues. 16-year-old Paul McCartney met Lennon in July 1957 and he joined the rhythm group. In February 1958, McCartney invited his friend, 15-year-old George Harrison, to sit in as the band was practicing. Harrison auditioned for Lennon, but he was considered to be too young to become a member of the band. You know how the squeaky wheel gets the grease? Harrison kept trying, showing up anytime he could, showing off his abilities. Lennon finally decided maybe he would work out, so Harrison was allowed in. As his first gig, Harrison played lead guitar on the second floor of a double-decker bus. He was then made lead guitarist. January 1959, most of the band had moved on. Lennon was taking classes at the Liverpool College of Art. On weekends, the three guitarists would play at nightclubs and open-air venues using the name Johnny and the Moondogs. Their style was limited to folk and rhythm and blues unless they could find somebody to join in who could play the drums. And he had to bring his own drums. This would allow them to play rock instead. Having to perform in their day-to-day clothing, the band went by the name The Rainbows for a while due to everybody having on different colored clothing. It was all the thing back then for musical groups to all dress the same. Surprisingly, they all wore suits and ties, and usually white shirts. Being on a limited budget, they had to use what they had, and so to kind of explain away their lack of color coordination, they called themselves the Rainbows. Stuart Sutcliffe, a fellow student with Lennon, sold one of his paintings, and then he was persuaded to purchase a bass guitar. Now, learning how to play it, he joined the multi-named group in January 1960. Being called the Rainbows and the Moondogs just didn't cut it. He suggested changing the band's name to the Beatles as a tribute to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. The spelling was changed to show the world that they were into the beat of the music. They used this name until May when they became the Silver Beatles. before undertaking a brief tour of Scotland as the backing group for pop singer and fellow Liverpudlian John Gentle. Liverpudlian, it sounds like a dish served on certain holidays by a grandmother who doesn't know how to cook. By the early July, they had refashioned themselves as the Silver Beatles, and by the middle of August, they dropped the silver and were back to simply being the Beatles. In the early days, Sutcliffe would perform with his back to the audience so that nobody could see just how few notes he was actually playing. Just because you have a guitar doesn't mean you can learn to play it real quick. What little I know about England comes from watching Monty Python, Faulty Towers, Doctor Who, and one or two other British TV shows. One was about a couple of flight attendants. At the time, they were referred to as stewardesses. When did that become a bad term? No, you can't call them stewardesses. Somebody might be offended. You got to call them flight attendants. Geez. Well, anyway, these two women were a couple of flight attendants, and they were roommates. In the show one episode, they were told they were being transferred by the airline to Liverpool, to which one of the roommates said, "They call people from Liverpool Liverpudlians," to which the other one began to cry. That's the only episode I remember of seeing the show, even though I watched it probably every week for several months. Can't find any reference to the show anywhere. Not that I really want to know. It got under my skin, and so I had to go look. I hate it when I can't find what I'm looking for. Let's get back to the Beatles. Peter Best joined the band as the drummer. Now they could do rock and roll all the time. The band was off on a tour of Germany. The gig was for 4.5 months. They had a contract to play at Bruno Koschmider's clubs only. Their contract said only his clubs. Well, to make a few extra bucks, they did a few side jobs at competing clubs, which landed them in hot water. Bruno fired the band, and he reported Harrison as being an underage performer to the authorities. Harrison was deported back to England, and the band was going to have to get along without him, their lead guitarist. They still had several months to go on their contract. Well, that didn't happen because about a week later, Koschmider had McCartney and Best arrested for arson after they set fire to a condom in a concrete corridor. The authorities deported them as well. The band was now down to two guys, the bassist who couldn't play, and one guitar. The fans were beginning to notice the five guys from Liverpool, even though three of them were not with the other two. The kids in Germany wanted them back. So, Kroschmider rehired the Beatles to play the following year. Sometime around here, the guys began using stimulants to get through all the performances they were booked on. Better living through chemical dependency. Yes, I grew up in the 60s. Half the guys I knew were on some form of drugs. Wait, that's just like it is today. Sutcliffe had met, and he wanted to marry a local gal, Astrid Kirchherr, and she's the one that gave him that haircut They call it the existentialist style that the band soon became known for. Sutcliffe then quit the band so he could pursue his art. Well, the Beatles were now a four-man band with McCartney playing bass. Their time in Germany made them even more popular back in Liverpool. Brian Epstein began wining and dining the band, trying to get them to sign on as their manager. They took him on in January 1962. Throughout early and mid 62, Epstein sought to free the Beatles from their contractual obligations to Burt Kempfert Productions. He eventually negotiated a 1 month early release in exchange for one last recording session in Hamburg. On their return to Germany in April, they were met with the news that Sutcliffe had died the previous day from a brain hemorrhage. I know the show is about McCartney dying. However, there are some other skeletons hiding in the closets. According to Pauline Sutcliffe, her brother was killed by one of the band members. Okay, this is what I read. Not something I dreamt up. This comes from Pauline's book, The Beatles' Shadow. Uh, According to her, Lennon may have had eyes for Sutcliffe. Hey, if you're a Beatles fan, don't go yelling at me. This is what she said. The real reason Lennon wanted Sutcliffe in the band was personal. Think about it. Would it make any kind of sense to hire a guy who can't play any musical instruments to play in a band? Everything was working out according to plan until Sutcliffe met and fell for Astrid Kirchherr. She was the one that gave the Beatles their signature hairstyle. Sutcliffe would fly home to visit his family from time to time, and Lennon knew he was going to be in town. According to Pauline, his sister, Lennon had anger issues back then. He was known for a short fuse and a fast fist. Lennon met Sutcliffe out front of his folks' home, and an argument took place. Pauline says she watched as Lennon punched her brother to the ground and then began kicking him, landing a few blows to his head. Once his anger was spent, Lennon ran away, leaving Sutcliffe unconscious on the sidewalk. Sutcliffe refused to see a doctor or press charges. He still considered Lennon his friend. Somehow, Sutcliffe was able to fly back to Hamburg, Germany, where his condition worsened over time. He died from a brain hemorrhage or a bleeding brain. That's what she says. The official cause of death was said to be due to an overuse of amphetamines. You choose which story you believe, and which was just there to sell books. The nasty, noisy, negative naysayers came out yelling and screaming that this was just a bunch of nonsense. They say Lennon never lost his cool. Sutcliffe just used too many drugs, and there was never any kind of a thing between them. They also said anybody that believes these things is way into conspiracy theories. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can see how something like this could get out of hand, but Why would the authorities in Germany not show any images of the injuries to Sutcliffe that should or could have been caused by a kick or two to the head? The band wasn't huge yet, so there wasn't a ton of money to be made. Maybe since the assault, if there was one, had taken place in England, this could have weighed heavily on any decisions to simply ignore what didn't much affect anyone in German society. Richard Starkey was born July 7th, 1940, in Dingle. What a name. Dingle, an inner city of Liverpool. He is the only child of confectioners Richard and Elsie Starkey. They made candy. What a sweet life, you might think. Elsie enjoyed singing and dancing, a hobby that she shared with her husband as an avid fan of swing music. Prior to the birth of their son, the couple spent much of their free time on the local ballroom circuit, but their regular outings ended soon after his birth. Elsie adopted an overprotective approach to raising her son that bordered on fixation. His dad, Big Richie, lost interest in his family, choosing instead to spend long hours drinking and dancing in pubs with women that were not his wife, sometimes for several consecutive days. This led to an eventual divorce. Little Richie said he hardly knew his dad, seeing as he was gone all the time. At the age of 6, little Richie developed appendicitis. Following a routine appendectomy, he contracted peritonitis, causing him to fall into a coma that lasted for days. His recovery took 12 months, which he spent away from his family at Liverpool in the Myrtle Street Children's Hospital. Upon his discharge in May 1948, his mother, being the doting mom that she was, allowed him to stay home, which led to his missing way too much school. By age 8, he was considered illiterate, with a poor grasp of mathematics. His lack of education contributed to a feeling of alienation at school, which resulted in his regularly playing hooky here in the US or truant in Britain. We call it hooky because the first term was known as being on your own hook. This was used a lot for farm kids who had to stay out of school a lot during harvest season. The term had no negative connotation until years later. Truancy refers to somebody who shirks their duties, especially one who stays out of school without permission. Little Richie did this a lot, causing him to miss far more school and slip farther behind his classmates. His neighbor, Mary McGuire Crawford, began tutoring him, trying to get him caught back up. It was working right up to the point little Richie contracted TB. In 1953, little Richie, now 13, was admitted to a tuberculosis sanitarium where he remained for 2 years. During his stay, the medical staff made an effort to stimulate motor activity and relieve boredom by encouraging their patients to join the hospital band, leading to his first exposure to percussion instruments. Right. He was allowed to bang on a cabinet with a spoon. That's not exactly a percussion instrument. Good things can come from bad beginnings. Little Richie began looking into becoming a drummer. The cabinet and the spoon gave way to an actual drum, followed by a couple of drums, followed by a drum set. Richie was given other instruments to play, but he was only interested in banging on the bongos like a chimpanzee. If you don't get that reference, you don't listen to Dire Straits enough. Little Richie attended St. Silas Primary School near his house, where his classmates began calling him Lazarus. Later, Dingle Vale Secondary Modern School, where he showed an aptitude for art and drama and mechanics. As a result of the prolonged hospitalization, he fell behind his peers scholastically and he was ineligible for what is known as the 11 plus qualifying examination required to attend grammar school. I have no idea what that is. Here in the US, you go to high school till you're 16 and drop out, or until you're 18 and graduate. After extended hospital stays following Richard's recovery from tuberculosis, he did not want to return to school, preferring instead to stay at home and listen to music while playing along by beating on cooking pots with a stick. April 17, 1954, Starkey's mother married Harry Graves. He was an ex-Londoner who had moved to Liverpool following the failure of his first marriage. Graves, an impassioned fan of big band music, loved to listen to their vocalists, introduced Richard, to recordings by Dinah Shore, Sarah Vaughan, and Billy Daniels. Graves said that he and Richard never had an unpleasant exchange between them. That is quite an accomplishment for a stepfather and a stepson. Richard said Harry Graves was great. He learned how to be a man from him. After his release from the sanitarium at 1955 at age 15, Richard Starkey, well, he's a little too big to be called Little Richie. Richard Starkey briefly held a railroad job with the British Rail. He was supplied with a hat but no uniform, and he was unable to pass the physical examination. He was laid off and then took unemployment benefits. He found work as a waiter, serving drinks on a day boat that traveled from Liverpool to North Wales, but his fear of conscription into the military service led him to quit the job. He didn't want to give the Royal Navy the impression that he was suitable for seafaring work. Mid 1956, a friend of his secured Richard a position as an apprentice machinist at the Henry Hunt and Sons, a Liverpool school equipment manufacturer. While working at the facility, Richard befriended Roy Trafford, and the two bonded over their share interest of music. Trafford introduced Richard to folk music, and he quickly became a fervent admirer. Instead of a drum, Richard played the washboard. Those of you into bluegrass and folk music will understand this. The rest of you just take my word for it. They play the washboard. The two began rehearsing songs in the manufacturing plant's cellar during their lunch breaks. The pair were joined by Starkey's neighbor and co-worker, a guitarist named Eddie Mills, and they formed the Eddie Mills Band, later renaming it Eddie Clayton and the Clayton Squares, which was a Liverpool landmark. The band performed popular folk songs such as the Rock Island Line and Walking Cane, with Richard raking a thimble across the washboard to create their rhythm. Richard also enjoyed dancing, as his parents had years before, and he did take some dancing lessons, but took too much time and it cost too much money. On Christmas Day, 1957, Richard received a second-hand drum kit consisting of a snare drum, a bass drum, and a makeshift cymbal that was made from a trash can lid. He got this from his stepdad, Harry Graves. Although basic and very crude, the kit facilitated his progression as a musician while increasing the commercial potential of Eddie Clayton's band, who went on to book local gigs before the folk craze music faded in early 1958 as rock and roll became popular in the UK. In November 1959, Richard joined Al Caldwell's Texans, a folk group who were looking for someone with a drum kit so the group could transition from one Liverpool's best known folk acts to a full fledged rock and roll band. They had begun playing local clubs as the Raging Texans and then Jet Storm and the Raging Texans before settling on Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Some of these names. Shortly before recruiting Richard, Richard Starkey wanted a better stage name, something more country sounding. Yes, country sounding. He began using the stage name Ringo Starr, derived from the fact that he wore a lot of rings, and it also implied a country and western influence. His singing solos were billed as Star Time. The Hurricanes became so successful when initially they were offered a highly coveted residence in Hamburg, they turned it down because they had too many prior commitments. They eventually accepted and they joined a little known group at the time, these guys calling themselves the Beatles, at the Bruno Koschmider's Kaiserkeller in October 1st, 1960, where Starr first met with the Beatles. Anytime Peter Best couldn't make a show, they would get Starr to sit in instead. Storm's Hurricanes were given top billing over the Beatles. They also received a lot more pay. Uh, the Hurricanes were the star attraction. The Beatles were just kind of like an intro band. October 15th, 1960, Ringo drummed with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, recording with them for the first time. During Starr's first stay in Hamburg, he also met Tony Sheridan, who liked his drumming abilities to the point that he asked Starr to leave the Hurricanes and join his band. Starr quit Rory Storm and the Hurricanes in '62, joined Sheridan in Hamburg before returning to the Hurricanes once again. August 14th, Starr accepted Lennon's invitation to join the Beatles. Brian Epstein fired their drummer, Peter Best. He said, "I've got some bad news for you. The boys want you out and Ringo in." Starr first performed as a member of the band August 18th, 1962, at a Horticultural Society dance at Port Sunlight. Best fans, upset by his firing, held vigils outside his home and at the club, shouting, Pete forever, Ringo never. Harrison received a black eye from one upset fan, and Epstein hired a bodyguard after his car tires were all slashed. You do know the name fan comes from fanatic? 1962, Epstein. Every time I say the name, I think of that other guy, the one that the politicians and the Hollywood elite hung out with. Brian Epstein. Maybe I'll just call him Brian. Brian was negotiating with record labels for a recording contract. To secure a UK recording contract, Brian negotiated the early band's contract with Polydor in exchange for more recordings backing Tony Sheridan. When the Beatles approached Decca Records, a Decca executive said, "No, the guitar bands are on their way out." How would you like to be that executive a few years later? People are going to want something different, he said. Brian wound up signing the band with EMI's Parlophone label instead. The band began pumping out albums and singles. Just about every single record went to number one in the charts. The music was different from all those who came before. This was catching on with the public. A little too much. Images of screaming girls making a horrible scene at each and every live performance was the norm. The phrase Beatlemania was coined after a live televised performance seen by 15 million fans. The unhinged behavior of the fans really gave me the willies. It looked more like a riot than a musical performance. 1962, the Beatles came to the US to more of the same screaming fans and near riots. The fans were going nuts to the point the music was almost drowned out. The money was pouring in faster than the four men could count it. Huge success sometimes leads to huge hatreds. They began receiving death threats from unknown sources. Ringo would arrange his cymbals so that they set at an angle to hopefully deflect any bullets coming his way. February 7th, 1964, the Beatles departed Heathrow Airport with an estimated 4,000 fans screaming and waving at the plane as it took off. Landing in New York City, a crowd estimated at 3,000 yelling and screaming fans showed up to greet them. All I ever saw of the Beatles was yelling and screaming. Girls with too much makeup crying black lines down their cheeks like Tammy Faye Baker used to do. They gave their first live U.S. television performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, which was watched by approximately 73 million viewers. It went in 23 million households, 34% of the American population. I remember watching Ed Sullivan. Anybody my age should have seen the show. As for the Beatles' performance, I didn't watch it. McCartney had a moped crash in December 1965. The official story is nobody was hurt, but his motor scooter was totaled. In 1966, rumors began to circulate that Paul McCartney was having serious health problems. This was followed by a story that the Beatles were going to disband as the members each wanted to go their separate way. Around September, the issue of McCartney's health changed to his being dead. One story going around was he was killed in a vehicle accident. They said Paul McCartney had stormed out of a recording session November 9th, 1966. Upset with the band, he got in his car and drove off into the night. At some point, McCartney got into a terrible accident that decapitated him. Another said that his health had declined until he'd simply stopped breathing. Fans were coming unglued. How could 25% of their most favorite band be taken from them so suddenly? The folks doing the PR for the band quickly rushed out reports of everything being fine. Nothing to see here. Stop calling the record studio every 5 minutes and don't look at the man behind the curtain. The Beatles press officer, Tony Barrow, was receiving hundreds of phone calls asking if McCartney was still among the living. He tried convincing people that he had just talked to Paul McCartney only a day ago, but folks wanted to know why they couldn't talk to him, or why had the band suddenly canceled their tour. A photograph was published showing all four Beatles and dated 1967. Most fans breathed a sigh of relief, while others looked at the image and said, "It's not him." People began examining the latest image and comparing it to photos from years ago. His ears looked wrong, they said. His eyebrows are too high, they said. His eyes don't look right. As the reports of McCartney's death began to take hold, rumors began to spread about the rest of the band. The other three members were told, if you want to stay with the cash cow, you'll go along with our official story. And keep in mind, most gigundous record companies would sell their own grandmothers for a hit song, let alone a band that was producing number one hits as if an assembly line. Anytime piles of cash are involved, the bad folks will get involved as well, one way or another. Not everybody with money is bad, but those bad folks with money will do anything they can to keep it. By 1966, the band had released their album Rubber Soul and Revolver to critical acclaim. They had played to 55,000 fans at Shea Stadium. The Beatles were on the upward trajectory, and they couldn't let something like a little death stop them. The rumors of Paul being dead began to grow. Folks were finding evidence of something nasty in the woodshed. Yes, that's a Cold Comfort Farm reference. The other members began to have second thoughts. Their friend and colleague had died, and here they were acting as if nothing had happened. The other Beatles, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, decided the show must go on. They hired a body double who also needed to be able to sing and play the guitar, not to forget writing number one hit songs. In the recording studio, it's simple to make somebody sound like somebody else. All those fancy recording gadgets can make a toad sound like a kitten. In public, things get a lot harder. Eventually, thought, eventually the three men thought, this will not do. In an effort to let the cat out of the bag, or was it just to sell records, they began making strange actions while in public. It would seem even the stand in was in on the idea. The White Album on the second to last track, Revolution 9, is a hidden message, only you have to play it backwards to hear it. If you do, which can be bad for your needle, you would hear a voice saying, "Turn me on, dead man." 1969, this was enough to convince many Beatles fans that Paul was the dead man in the recording. Backmasking is a recording technique in which a message is recorded backwards onto a track that is meant to be played forward. The human mind is an incredible device. It can somehow interpret things faster than the fastest computer. I used to think that this was all just nonsense until I did more research. It turns out many psychological studies have shown that the mind can capture these backward signals and turn them around. This works especially well if you listen to the record over and over and over, like a lot of kids do. The backwards playing of records was advised as training for magicians by occultist Alistair Crowley. My cat was about to jump up on the desk and I was trying to stop him. He's a big cat. Alistair Crowley, who suggested in his 1913 book Magic that an adept train himself to think backwards by external means, one of which was to listen to phonograph records reversed. In the movie Gold Diggers of 1935, the end of the dancing piano musical number, "The Words Are in My Heart," is filmed in reverse motion, with the accompanying instrument score incidentally being reversed as well. When records are recorded right there in the studio, they were limited in what they could do. With the advent of magnetic tape, the sky was the limit. You could do all kinds of wild things while recording. 1959, a vocal group called the Eligibles released a record called Car Trouble, which contained two nonsensical passages. When reversed, they revealed the phrases, "And you get my daughter back by 10:30, you bum," as well as, "Now look it, here, cats, stop playing these records backwards." Car Trouble is believed to be the first hit record to contain backmasking. The Beatles began incorporating masqué concrete inspired tape manipulation techniques into the recordings in the mid 60s. They were responsible for popularizing the concept. John Lennon and producer George Martin both claimed they had discovered backwards recording technique during a recording of the 1966 Revolver and the single Rain. Lennon said that while under the influence of a little marijuana, he'd accidentally played Rain in reverse, and he liked what he was hearing. After sharing the results with the other Beatles, the effect was used on tape loops, and the guitar solo on Tomorrow Never Knows, and later on Lennon's vocal in Rain. According to Martin, the band had been experimenting with changing the speeds and reversing the Tomorrow Never Knows tapes. Martin got the idea of reversing Lennon's vocals and guitar, which he did with a clip from Rain. Lennon then liked the effects and kept them. Guilt began to weigh heavy on the remaining Beatles, and they started leaving clues in their music as well. February 1967, a strange aside appeared in the Beatles' monthly book, the band's official fan magazine. Stories about the Beatles are always flying around, the magazine noted. A rumor has swept London that Paul McCartney has been killed in a car crash on the M1. But of course, there was absolutely no truth in it at all. And kind of like how the press secretary keeps trying to explain things that we all know are not as they seem. Those drones everybody's seeing? Nonsense. Record companies may never lie. Okay. McCartney appeared in public looking very much alive, and the Beatles released a Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in May of '67. The fans could go back and pay their hard earned cash to buy records and tickets to concerts. However, the album cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band is filled with clues as to McCartney not being among the living. The four members are seen on the cover twice. Two sets of Beatles standing over what could be perceived as a grave. The older phased Beatles to the left look over the grave mournfully, dressed in drab colored suits. The second group of Beatles standing in the center are the new Beatles. They are dressed in bright colored clothing, looking very much alive. Below the red flowers is a group of yellow flowers that are formed into the shape of a left-handed bass. Paul played a left-handed bass. There are only 3 strings on the guitar. One is missing, as if maybe Paul is missing. While the other 3 Beatles carry brass instruments, McCartney is carrying a cor anglus, a double reed woodwind instrument that has been interpreted as a symbol of death. Paul is out of step with the other Beatles, just as he was on the cover of that Abbey Road album. The interpretation is that Paul walks among the dead. In the corner next to the doll, wearing a Welcome to Rolling Stones outfit, is a reddish driving glove, symbolizing McCartney's bloody car crash. Aleister Crowley is on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, one of the many famous people that is pictured. If you split the cover diagonally using a mirror, at the very top of this diamond-shaped image is Crowley. His head predominates over everyone else. Right at the bottom of the cover, you see flowers form an insignia that is identical to the A which Crowley used in his signature and is famously portrayed in the shape of a male sex organ. Sex magic was a central component of Crowley's teachings. In the middle of the cover is the emblem for Crowley's mystical order, the OTO. The palm tree on the right side of the album will appear on both sides in the mirror, forming a border. This symbol is significant in Freemasonry and refers to the 2 demons that guarded Solomon's temple, Boaz and Jachin, that are said to have stood on the porch. The Beatles hired Michael Cooper as the principal photographer for the album cover. The photo shoot occurred at Cooper's London studio. Paul McCartney is supposed to have come up with the album title. He based the concept for the album on an old photograph showing Paul's father's old orchestra standing around a brass drum that read Jim Mack's Band. Peter Blake and his wife Jane Haworth designed and assembled the set. After 8 days of preparation, the Beatles arrived at the studio where Cooper shot them, using a camera, and they posed in front of various life-size cardboard cutouts of famous people. Some of these cutouts did not show up on the album cover. Behind George Harrison is one of these missing characters. You can just make out part of the figure peering out from behind the right side of Harrison's head. The image of actor Timothy Carey from a scene in the Stanley Kubrick's film The Killing. The cutout shows Timothy Carey holding a rifle. The barrel of the gun extends behind Paul McCartney. The barrel of the gun is pointed directly behind his heart. Some say Lennon is uh, some say Lennon, Harrison, and Ringo were in on this deception, but they didn't like it. They took steps to educate the fans by using clues hidden in their albums. Others say the three were the ones who came up with this deception. If this were the case, why would they put clues on on their complicity where the folks could see them? Money was on the line. The band is just fantastic. That is really what I think. Okay, and now they're a man short. What to do? Bands have survived the loss of members on occasion. Think Leonard Skinnerd. They lost four members in a plane crash, and they managed to make a comeback, but their music was not the same. Had McCartney been just one of the musicians, the loss and replacement could have gone without a hitch. McCartney was half of their songwriting talent. There are some things a replacement just can't do, unless the songwriting was done by committee. Say you've got 10, 12, 14 people sitting around a table and they're saying, oh, yeah, the fans would like this, and no, I don't think the fans would like that. What does the studio think will be a success and make millions of dollars? A lot of musicians today don't sound the way they do when they sing, and they can't write their own music. They can't even hardly sign their own names, let alone sing. The record companies pay folks to make these toads sound like kittens. You've heard of the monkeys? Hey, hey, we're the monkeys. They performed all their own music, except for some of the singing and most of the musical playing. The song, So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star by the Byrds, was a jab at the music industry that could create a rock group out of a bunch of TV actors and make money doing it. 1966, the record companies knew what people wanted to hear, and they were going to create it one way or another, even if it meant writing songs by committee of experts, even if it meant creating a facade by replacing one singer-songwriter with another. If offered enough money, the record companies could find anything they needed. What they needed was somebody that looked like McCartney. The man they found was William Campbell. Campbell also went by the name Billy Shears. Campbell, luckily, not only bore a striking resemblance to McCartney, he could sing like him as well, had the same voice. I've seen some Elvis impersonators that, well, they kind of missed the bus a lot. A black midget Elvis is kind of hard on the senses. However, if he's having a good time and he's making a few bucks, more power to him. Puddles Pity Party used to be an Elvis impersonator until he put on that clown suit. Literally. 1969, a college student in Michigan revived the rumor that Paul was dead. Tom Zarsky called into a radio show and said that he wanted to prove that Paul was dead. He suggested that the DJ play the intro for Revolution Number 9 from the Beatles' White Album. As audiences across the country listened, they heard what sounded like a man's voice, muttering, "Turn me on, dead man." The other Beatles felt guilty about swapping out McCartney, and they never mourned his death. So they began to leave subtle clues in their album artwork and songs. In the song Strawberry Fields Forever, it contains a backwards message that says, "I buried Paul, and I am so tired." Also in the song, you can find "Paul is dead. Miss him, miss him, miss him." In the song "Got to Get You Into My Life," it starts out with, "I was alone. I took a ride. I didn't know what I would find there." He didn't notice that the lights had changed. On the song "I Am a Walrus," or no, "I Am the Walrus," you can hear "Bury My Body" and "Oh Untimely Death," which appears towards the end. That well known image of the Beatles walking across the street, the one that shows up everywhere, even in the Minions movie. Why is McCartney the only one barefoot? I don't know about the weather over there, but here in Texas, you don't walk barefoot on the streets. You'll cook your tootsies. The way the four members are walking makes fans think of a funeral procession. McCartney is out of step with the others, and his eyes are closed, which is said to represent his own death. Well, the death of the guy that he's pretending to be. With rumors of McCartney having died and been replaced, the album sales took off once more. Sgt. Pepper's and the Magical Mystery Tour both re entered the charts after having been off for over 9 months. Folks were buying the albums so they could do their own research and maybe get to the bottom of the story. By 1969, the Beatles were on their way out. The members were looking to do their own work, and the constant questions about McCartney were getting annoying. Just about any interview was going to get around to "Paul is dead." They each began recording songs and taking jabs at each other. It looked as if they each blamed the others for the band going belly up. Folks who don't want to believe any conspiracy theories say the whole thing was just a publicity stunt that got a little out of hand. They like to live in a world where the government has our best interests at heart and doctors know what is really best for you. If you find the idea of record companies or musical groups doing things just a bit not true, then just consider the possibility. Uh, could McCartney have been killed in 1966 and he was buried using somebody else's name in a grave that his fans will never visit? Would the man that we know today as Paul McCartney continue telling the world that he was who he said he was? Or would he eventually grow tired of the facade and come clean? I don't have a horse in this race. To me, the question is a non starter. If McCartney is still McCartney and the entire death story was just to sell records, I'm neither ahead nor behind. If some guy has been running around passing himself off as another man, I still don't have any loss or gain. It's not like, oh, say, the President of the United States was shot in Dallas and an innocent man was framed for the event that eventually led to the change in an entire world's course of history. Now, that one gets me mad. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. I hope I didn't confuse y'all like I confused myself. If you like the show, pass it around. Let other people know that maybe they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. If you didn't like it, why are you still listening? Until next Saturday, Happy New Year.
Are you coming to the tree where there strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.